Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变世
Change
界
organizations.
Change the world.
Since I'm the last presenter in this section on the causes, just before the section on the consequences, I also want to take some time at the end to tell you about another event, another possible radical change that may happen, which is the consequences of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And so these are two questions that actually relate to the same region in the world, and they're typically thought of as different questions and studied by different people. And I'll try to not stray too far into thinking about whether Iran will acquire nuclear weapons, but bring it back to the consequences on comparative politics and the prospects of democracy in the region. So when we think about what explains the Arab Spring, I think that the first thing that, as political scientists, we should do is be humble about the difficulty of predicting such radical changes. It's no different from the collapse of the Soviet Union or the economic crisis in 2008. Big transitions or big changes happen rarely, and we can say that many people said that it was possible, but they also said that many other things were possible. So I think that the first things we need to do is be humble about the ability of political science to explain or have predicted this event. But still, I think there are things that are very useful to make sense of the pattern. And so if we think about the key determinants of democracy, here we can divide them into economic, political, and international factors, and that may betray my bias. I was trained as an economist. I'm teaching political science and doing research on international relations. So there may be other factors that are not on this list, but I think that they're very helpful. And what I want to get a sense now is just tell you briefly what are the arguments that the literature has made, how robust and how confident we are in those relationships, and how helpful they are in understanding the Arab Spring. So when we look at the economic factors, the first is income. And this was one of the first positive relationships, which was that with development, populations come to ask for political rights. As this theory was running into problems in the post-World War II period, other people have said that it's not really income, it should be income inequality. And inequality tells us about how much is at stake and what is the difference between the haves and the have-nots. So we may have states like more recently China or Singapore where the economy is growing, but if there's not much discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, we may not be so confident that democracy will come to these countries. Another one would be oil wealth, which is that if a state needs to get income from the private citizens, it needs to negotiate with them and may accede to political rights. But if money comes from extraction of natural resources like oil wealth, there may not be this tension between the population and the government to ask for political rights. And so if countries are lucky to have oil wealth, they may end up with a curse where they do not develop into democracies. If we look at political factors, first element is regime type. So when Huntington wrote this book and looked back at political developments in the third wave of democracy, one of the things he noticed is that we may look at commonalities between different dictatorships, and dictatorships may be compared by their regime type. So we can see military dictatorships, single-party dictatorships, and there may be similarities within those types. People who rule those dictatorships may have common interests and capabilities within their type, and that may help us think about the likelihood that these countries democratize. Second is semi-democratic institutions. Countries may set up legislatures or parliament to alleviate information problems, divide and rule, co-opt the opposition that may help them survive longer. And finally, international factors, great power politics and norms and institutions. So in terms of great power politics, there's some evidence, and Professor Bosch spoke about this, that since the end of the Cold War, it's been easier to push for democracy. And for example, the time after a coup to the next election has been shorter since the end of the Cold War than it was during the Cold War. In terms of norms and institutions, there's a growing interest now on the role of election observers in ensuring that elections are free and fair and the impact that they may have in ensuring the democracy. So these are sort of, in short, the posited relationship. So if we think about how confident we are in the effect of each of these factors and how useful they are for the Arab Spring, if we look at income, I'm hopeful that Professor Bosch's piece will settle the debate on modernization and development and democracy. But I think that we also have to be humble and look back. If we had asked a question in 1960, we would have said, of course, development causes democracy. We look around the world, we see developed countries that are democratic. If we fast forward to 2000, we would have said, well, there's been all these problems in the Cold War, in the Cold War period. Development doesn't cause democracy, but it makes sure that if a country is democratic, it will remain democratic. And some people still abide by that view. They may not have told you that Tunisia would have been the first country to protest against their dictatorship and make that transition to democracy, but they would have said, I'm relatively confident as a wealthier country that it may have the greater odds of remaining democratic. If we'd fast forward another 3 years, we would have said, based on Professor Bosch's work with Susan Stokes, that looking only at the post-World War II period was too restrictive a sample, and it missed all these countries in the Western world that were democratic and developed, and we should look back to 1850, and there we would see a causation from income to democracy. But then if we forward in another 5 years, we would have said we needed to go all the way back to 1500 to see development and democracy both because that critical juncture. So I think maybe this piece will settle the debate, but I think that this is such a hotly contested issue that we need to be humble about our confidence of the effect of income on democracy. As for income inequality, I think it makes sense that there should be enough that the population wants to resist against the dictatorship, but there's theoretical and empirical challenges. Theoretically, our theories are predicting that if there's too much tension, dictatorship will make sure that we'll have too much to lose from trying to democratize, and democracy will not happen. And that's troubling theoretically because we may see people who are so desperate in the difference between the haves and the have-nots that one person sets himself on fire, too many people go out on the street, and it overwhelms the dictatorship, and maybe the dictatorship falls and democracy continues. And empirically, the data is even worse on income inequality than it is on income. And so that also reduces our confidence of the effect. As for oil wealth, there is this clear, so simple theory that if there's more oil wealth, the likelihood of democracy is lower. There's been a more sophisticated theory that if you have more oil wealth, it attenuates these tensions brought about by income inequality, and it may help a country remain democratic or be democratic. And now, one problem with that is one of the chief examples to make that sophisticated theory was Venezuela, which now that Chavez has been in power, we would be less prone to make as an argument that oil wealth may have this more complex effect on democracy. Great power politics and norms and institutions may have an effect. But there's been few periods in terms of hegemon or balance of power, and these things change slowly, so we may again be less confident. So the part that I want to focus on is regime type. And here I think we have a little more confidence of the effect of regime type on democracy. And I think it rings true on the case of the Arab Spring. And the first effect is that military dictatorships are unstable. So when Huntington made this point that we should look at types of dictatorships, afterwards political scientists have started coding information about dictatorships and regime types, and it's led to big data sets and a lot of work. And one fact that comes out robustly is that military dictatorships are unstable. And if we see and we look around in the Arab Spring, with the exception of Bahrain, the regimes that have felt these troubles are military dictatorships. And so maybe political scientists would have had a harder time telling you when the Arab Spring happens, but if a bunch of countries are about to go through this transition, we would have had more confidence in saying that military dictatorships would be those countries. The problem is that those theories were based on prior experience, and they face some problems. So the explanations would be that the reason why military dictatorships are unstable is that military officers are brought to care about corporate unity and the unity of the country, and they're reluctant to fire against each other and populations, and when there is a challenge to their rule, they leave. So this is this first example, this first theory that military officers have a greater sense of unity. They don't want to fight, and they leave office. And the other is that military officers, because of their skills, can make sure that their post-exit fate is safer, and they can extract rents from the next government and make sure that so they don't fear leaving office as much as career politicians would. The problem with this is that if we look at data on the post-exit fate of military officers, they face the worst fate relative to other dictators. But if they do care about unity, then we shouldn't see them quarreling with each other, jailing or killing one another. And if they can secure an attractive fate after exit, they should at least avoid being jailed or killed. And this evidence we don't see. So this is data based on 1946 to 2004, based on whether the next leader is a dictator or a Democrat. So this is, the first table is the next leader is a dictator, and the second one, the next leader is a Democrat. And we see that maybe Huntington was right, that the military dictatorships are involved in the transition, and maybe they can do slightly better. The categories here are recording the fate of the leader up to a year after he's left office and coding the worst punishment, so going to the right in that scale. So we see that maybe military dictators would have done slightly better, but when we look at transitions in dictatorships, they do worse. And they're more likely to be killed than non-military dictators. So how do we make sense of this evidence? Do we need a different theory for transitioning to democracy and one to transitioning to dictatorship? I think that, and this is resonance with the Arab Spring, is that military dictators represent a greater threat. So it's not too surprising that fighting has to happen against a Gaddafi or a Saleh. These are leaders that you cannot trust would remain silent and compliant in the next regime. They have this ability to threaten the next regime. They have this capacity to use violence. They're more threatening. But they would be less threatening after a transition to democracy. So let's caveat for now why. But if military dictators represent a greater threat, when challengers have a chance, they eliminate them. And military dictators understand they would be less threatened after a transition to democracy. That would be a reason to try to make that transition faster, which is that they can secure a more favorable post-tenure fate. Now, why would a transition to democracy increase or ameliorate or improve the post-tenure fate of leaders? For two properties of democracy, one going back to Dahl in the early 70s, one is inclusiveness. So this is a regime that selects leaders based on popularity or the ability to mobilize popular support. These are different skills than having a handful of people mount a coup. And the other is public contestation for office, which is the recognition of each other's right that somebody can run for office and try to present a platform and become a leader. And both of these make a transition to democracy reduce the threat that a military dictator would represent. So if it selects leaders who are less good at using violence, it makes the transition to a democracy less threatening. And if there would be greater contestation for office, then the threat of using violence to come back to office is less present, because there would be this pushback from society to ensure that the elected leader remains in office and violence is not used to get into office. But I think the difficulty then comes back to our theories and our understanding of what happens with democracy, because our current theories imply a unique mapping from material conditions into political outcomes. So we can tell you if income is a particular level or inequality is a particular level, we expect democracy to happen or not. And the difficulty here, and that comes in the second element of public contestation for office, which is that there needs to instill the belief that, yes, political rights will be protected. So you may be one day where there's no protest against dictatorship, but then the next day somebody is setting himself on fire, there's enough popular outrage, and there is a critical mass that the situation is unsustainable and democracy should happen. And also, so So in a sense, sort of in technical terms, we've done theories with unique equilibria, but I think that the reality is that there are multiple equilibria. With given material conditions, in some cases people trust each other, and in other cases they don't, and it's very hard for us to understand how they come to trust one another. So this is I think the remaining question that needs to be given more attention. Now, so coming back to shifting gears and thinking about what are the consequences of Iran getting the nuclear bomb, I personally think it's unlikely it will get a nuclear weapon, and we can come to the question of why in the Q&A. But again, the concerns can be economic, but assuming that Iran gets a nuclear bomb, we can divide those concerns on economic, political, and international. You know, the economic concerns, disruption of oil markets. Political concerns may be that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it could consolidate the regime. So you could take a page from what happened to Gaddafi and say he dropped his nuclear weapons program. If he hadn't, maybe he would still be in power, and maybe that would be a downside of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And the other is, if it acquires nuclear weapons, it could threaten allies and threaten them so much that they would want to themselves acquire nuclear weapons. And this final concern of regional proliferation is the one that's been most salient, especially lately in Obama's description of the dangers of Iran going nuclear. So I'll talk more about this. But if we look at this middle concern of consolidation of the Iranian regime, looking back to what we said so far, Iran, as a non-military dictatorship with parliamentary institutions, is a relatively stable dictatorship. So I think the odds of seeing an Iranian regime crumble are lower than they were for the military dictatorships in the Middle East. And sort of if we just take a second to think about the benefits of striking, the nuclear program is so popular in Iran that if the benefit of trying to go for a strike is to take out the regime and take out the nuclear program, the odds are that the next regime that comes after, given the popular support for a nuclear program, would still keep that program alive. So when we think about nuclear standoff with allies and regional proliferation, Iran getting the bomb is scary because of how much damage they're doing to US interests now. But I think that that's also why getting nuclear weapons is not that big of a shift in the balance of power or how afraid we should be of the consequences. What Iran is engaged now is low-level threats and damage on US interests that most often leave plausible deniability. These are not acts that require or warrant a response of a foreign invasion or a full-scale conflict. Now, if Iran gets weapons, maybe it will do more of those. But these are not the radical concerns that people have when they advocate for a military strike against Iran now. If we think about proliferation, this is, I guess, one great thing about nuclear questions, which is the number of cases is so small that somebody can say, in all the cases, in no cases has it happened. And somebody who disagrees says, well, those two cases are exceptions. But the US was in a similar situation in the mid-90s when it thought about attacking North Korea and came upon the Green Framework and decided not to do it. And I think those situations are similar because North Korea was in a situation to inflict a lot of damage on US interest in South Korea. But for all the fears of what would happen if North Korea gets the bomb, the US has been able to reassure its allies in the region, and they have not acquired nuclear weapons. I think another thing, so I think it's likely to be in the similar situation that our allies in the regions did not acquire nuclear weapons when Israel nuclearized, and they cannot count on our support against Israel, but they can against Iran. So I think I think sort of to think back about the dangers for proliferation and the dangers that, or the concerns that these countries would have should Iran get nuclear weapons, there are clear red lines that Iran could cross, and an attack or an invasion on US allies in the regions is one such clear red lines. There are activities that it can engage in low-level activities that could be damaging to our allies in the region. But I think then it comes back to the question which we had mentioned before, which is that many of the allies in the regions are non-democratic countries, and it's possible that the concerns which were up at the start of the Arab Spring, which is that Iran would try to broaden its influence in the region, they might still continue to do it, and if they fund groups in those countries that would threaten the legitimacy of the government, I think that the role for the U.S. government is to convince them that if these are low-level activities, they don't warrant a full-scale invasion. The better response is to try to address these domestic problems that Iran could create for those regimes. So again, the question comes to how to ensure the legitimacy of rule in these U.S. allies. So just in conclusion, what explains the Arab Spring? I think we need to be modest that this was a radical change that was hard to predict. Should it happen, we could have said with more confidence which countries would have been in the greater problems, and these are the military dictatorships. But again, this is the challenge for theory in thinking about democratization, is to think more seriously about how people come to trust and believe that political institutions or democracy can work or are legitimate. Because when we see these events, when we see the events flip, it's not that the material conditions change, but but the role of beliefs in future behavior are important. In terms of the consequences of an Iranian bomb, I think that the fears of regional proliferation are exaggerated, but again, the dangers for allies in the region could be low-level threats to the legitimacy of their rule, and the response there should be a move towards greater democratization, greater democracy. So, thank you.
Now we have a little more time.
Okay.
So, Professor Both.
So I have a question about these really interesting data on military dictatorships, and I wonder whether we are not treating military dictatorships as this the same thing, and they are very different. So if you think about the level of involvement of military officers in the economy, you go from Chile, kind of. They think of themselves as German, bureaucratized, and everything, Bavarian in a way, in some way, not democratic, but Bavarian, to Egypt, where the involvement is very, very big, and in the middle probably Turkey. So this must have some impact on calculations about transiting, about intervening again, and I don't know if you have thought about this.
No. I think that because of their capacity to use violence, they're in a situation where whether they're in power, they can ensure certain things and make sure that the law is written in a way that they can protect their economic interests. But even when they're out of power, they can still negotiate or make sure that their interests are protected. And that's a difference between military dictatorships and military dictators and non-military dictators whose power is tied to their being in office. So I mean, there can be variation within military dictators, but I think that the fact that they are more threatening explains both why they face this worse fate in a transition within dictatorship, and they may be more tempted to try to leave office. Now, when we say there's variations within between military dictatorships, the typical variation that people think about is the definition of military dictatorship, which is whether it's based on characteristics of the leader or characteristics of the group that holds the leader in office. This data I showed you was based on characteristics of the leader. There's more data with that classification, but the results are the same even if you look at the group keeping the leader in office. Yeah.
What do you think is the significance of commodities prices in terms of volatility to the stability of some of the regimes? I'm thinking of wheat for Egypt. I'm thinking of oil for oil-producing countries.
Yeah, I have a student at Yale who's looking at that question, and there's some work on what is the effect of crises, and some of these crises could be brought by volatility or drop in commodity prices. There's some work from the 80s about how military dictatorships could be more vulnerable to economic crises. But again, I think that these are shocks, just like Professor Bosch mentioned, there's other shocks to the legitimacy of a rule that could lead to transition. So, the Falklands War was one such shock. I mean, it was instigated by the Argentinian, but the fact that it was unsuccessful could have coordinated beliefs that this was not a regime that could continue. So I guess I'd say I know of some, on the crises question, I know of some work that's from the mid-'80s and some more recent work. I think, as you're trying to build a complete picture of the various effects on democracy, that's one to consider, yeah.
When you talked about the income, you raised the other issue of income inequality and disparity to make it a little bit more complex of a picture. But what about corruption, the other financial factor of corruption? How does that affect? Because you can have income growth in general, but it's in the hands of a few, that affects the political process. How does corruption factor into this whole analysis?
Yeah, so in this analysis it doesn't, but there's some work that does, and I think a challenge when there is corruption, I mean, there's two challenges. One is, if you survey people, they'll tell you that we think there is corruption. So when do they come to say we think there is corruption to we should mobilize against it? And I think that's another element where we don't understand how you go from believing that something is bad to saying it's illegitimate and there'll be enough uproar that it's worth it to put my body on the line and protest against the regime. But the other one is, who do you hold accountable for corruption? And so there's some work in China that's looking at the corruption of local officials. And the story being that local officials being corrupt, or the information that you can use on their corruption, is used by the central government to discipline its local officials. But I think it raises the interesting question of why doesn't it lead to loss of legitimacy of the whole system? I mean, the central government is putting local officials in situations where they would gain a lot from selling land. They want to show that they have growth, so they can expropriate farmers, give it to businesses, try to grow the economy faster. So when do you come to a population saying it's not, the agent is just a messenger and the problem is at the center? And that's another question that is not well answered.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变
改变世界 Change organization.
Change
दुनिया में
organization.
बदलाव.
Change the world.